The following interview suffered audio problems only discovered after the fact. The interview is too important not to go out. My apologies, John. Hello and welcome to another episode of FTD Talk. I'm your host John James and I am a writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence. In this episode I'll be talking to nurse practitioner Emma Durmaz about her work with victims of abuse with special attention to gender differences. I hope you find it interesting. Hi Emma, welcome to FTD Talk.
Hi John, thank you.
Can you please begin by telling me a little bit about yourself, what you do, and your background, please?
Okay, so I work as an advanced nurse practitioner in a GP surgery, which essentially, it's like being a GP, see the same number of people, same caseload, prescribe for patients, diagnose and refer. My past history involves working alongside West Mercia Police as a sexual assault nurse examiner. So that would involve taking evidence from people who've been sexually assaulted and processing that evidence and potentially providing expert witness evidence in court. And obviously, whilst doing this job, I kind of did a deep dive into the whole of the issues surrounding domestic and sexual violence against anybody, irrespective of age or sex. And I think there is quite a lot of disinformation out there and a lot of misunderstanding about how victims and survivors cope with what's happened to them, and also how professionals manage people that present to them with these concerns. So it's something I'm very passionate about, and I think it's really important as professionals that we gain a good understanding of all the issues involved.
Thanks. I want to tell my audience a little bit about our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
In 2017, as some people know, I came out of an abusive relationship, and the GPs that I saw were amazing. And you were one of the people that I saw.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think about what I told you, and was it a typical story that you've heard?
Not typical, in so much as most of the domestic violence and abuse that professionals deal with is female victims with male perpetrators. But I am very, very aware that for male victims or survivors, which I prefer to kind of think of them, is that sometimes professionals have difficulty getting their head around that relationship and how the abuse could happen to a male. And I think we need to be very open-minded about this, because it isn't gender-based. It's something that can happen in any relationship, irrespective of gender or sexuality. And it's about listening in an open way to that person when they present to you, and trying to gain an understanding of how it affects them, and also to look at some of the safeguarding issues concerned, and to help support that individual to make choices that will help them in a safe way. And once they've come out of that relationship, it's about providing the support and care to help people to move on. Because I think what people tend to forget is that any kind of domestic violence or sexual violence is all about control and coercion. It's not necessarily about sexuality. And for victims, when they have that control taken away from them, that's really difficult for them sometimes to move forwards.
You talk about the gender differences there. Do you think there's a difference in support needs for the genders?
I think the support needs are similar, but I think for men, they need a safe space to know that they can come forward and be believed. Because I think the kind of psychological issues that men face is slightly different. Because a lot of men, especially if they are victims of female perpetrated domestic or sexual violence, is that they worry that their perpetrator will turn the tables on them and say, well, obviously I'm a woman, I can't be the perpetrator in this. And I think it's very difficult for men to come forward. When you deal with sexual violence as well, there's a lot of issues there for men, maybe questioning their sexuality. And often female perpetrators will tell men, well, you're not a man because you're not standing up to me. And when men are told that time after time after time, sometimes that can affect their kind of self-esteem and how they feel about themselves. So I think there are similar issues for male and female victims, but I think for male victims particularly, I kind of feel that they're discriminated against massively. Because when you look at the government response to domestic violence, it's mainly about female victims. And indeed, there was a government publication entitled Violence Against Women and Girls. And when I saw that, I felt really frustrated because I thought, well, what about men and boys? And I think having a document like that forces people to think it is a gender-based issue when in fact it isn't. So there's a lot of issues, I think, and I think for men coming forwards, it can be really difficult for them, and I think we need to recognise that and be more open-minded to it.
Yeah, there's a lot of things there that struck home with the way I felt when I was going through my abuse. And I don't want to get you into trouble, Emma.
No, no.
But do you think and have you seen gendered attitudes in the medical profession?
Absolutely. I've spoken with colleagues in the past who, when they say, oh, I've been speaking to a man today and he's suffering with domestic violence, and often they will say, well, how can that happen? Because he's stronger than her. And it isn't about strength, it's about that coercive nature about domestic abuse. And I think a lot of people think domestic abuse is about people presenting with bruises and things like that. And yes, that happens. But the big part of it is that coercive nature of it, where over time you are run down, your self-esteem is at rock bottom, you're made to feel small. And it's really difficult to kind of, manage that. So I completely understand why males maybe wouldn't want to come forward because, if we can't understand, then how are they going to make us understand?
Yeah, that's a huge problem. The men having the strength in character, not strength in character, but having the strength to come forward, not being that they're going to be ridiculed by any, and especially if somebody that they're supposed to trust, like the medical profession or the police.
Yeah. And I think society is completely and utterly to blame. And I mean, I'm not a lover of reality TV, but I decided to watch Married at First Sight UK. And I was appalled at some of the abusive and aggressive nature of some of the women in that process. And one woman was swearing at this bloke, and he said, I thought she was going to hit me. And the way that was viewed by the other people, it was almost like it was funny. Whereas if you turn the tables and that had been a man swearing and being, aggressive towards somebody, they would have been arrested, and they later had this woman on, the after show, if you like. and they were all clapping her, you know, saying what a character she was. And I felt really disgusted by that, because I thought if that was a man, they wouldn't have given him airtime, you know. So I think people view this as like, it's appalling, you know, and that is discrimination. And I think the fact that the people watching it probably thought it was funny as well, and I was appalled by it. And I just thought, you know, this is a program that probably is watched by quite a lot of young people, and if they think that's acceptable behavior from a woman, then I'm sorry, but you know, I found it absolutely appalling. And the fact that it's on television and that behavior is almost being applauded, you know, what hope is there in the future, and what message is that sending out? And I think, you know, it's totally unacceptable.
Well, this is one of the things I was going to ask you, because male victims of abuse are faced with skewed societal attitudes, powerful women's groups, a biased media, and men afraid to speak out. Can things change? Do you think things can change?
I hope they can. I mean, I find the whole kind of sexuality of a lot of these reality TV shows quite distressing, because if you look at how young people view sex, that's actually quite skewed. We know that a lot of young people have viewed pornography as young as the age of 10 to 12. And young people will say that they think the sex that they see in porn is normal sex, whereas it isn't. You know, and I think the fact that young people think that that's normal, I kind of think we're storing up a whole generation of potential, you know, sexually coercive and abusive relationships, and also, you know, encouraging that demeaning attitude towards men. And on this same show was a really lovely man who was obviously very much in touch with his emotional side. And the person that he was paired with, she said, "Well, you're not my normal type. I usually go for, men that are like proper men." And the person who was the counsellor said, "Oh, you mean an aggressive male role model?" And she said, "Yes." And I just thought, the whole thing is totally wrong. It's almost as if some of these women feel that to have a man who is aggressive in nature is a good thing. Whereas personally, I would much prefer a man who's in touch with his emotions and is kind and empathetic. And yet that seemed to be something that, you know, was almost counted against him. You know, and I think it's really difficult. And I think you're going to have a generation of women who don't prize that positive empathy in men, and just, you know, do they want to be messed around? And I think it's really sad. I hope that society is beginning to see that being a real man is about care and empathy and being able to support your partner irrespective of sexuality. But I think there's a long way to go, and I think the whole issue about male victims of domestic and sexual violence, I think professionals need to really take a long, hard look at themselves. And it's not just about how you react when someone presents with that. It's about changing your whole kind of, you know, value system to believe that domestic abuse can happen to anybody in any relationship, and that could be same-sex relationships as well. So I think we just need to be really open about how we have our own kind of discriminations, you know, and sometimes that can be difficult. But I'm just going to stop that ringing. Just bear with me a second. Sorry about that, John. Yeah, I mean, I just think that we need to almost re-examine our own professional values and to try and say, I didn't realise that this was a problem, and I need to manage it. So I really hope moving forwards that we can make a difference. I think the other problem for men is that those support systems are lacking. When I first started working in the sexual violence arena, there's a lot of support out there for women, and some of those women's groups, when I asked them about, well, can't you provide a service for men? They were like, well, it's not about men, it's about women, and women are discriminated against, you know. And I've even heard people say all men are rapists, which is not true, you know. So I think there is a kind of feminist backlash within these support arenas to say it's a female based problem. It isn't. It is not gender based. It can happen to anybody. And I think for men trying to find that support, it can be really difficult. You know, you've got Women's Aid, you know, but I am aware that some Women's Aid centres do support men. But as a man looking for help, you probably wouldn't think of going to Women's Aid, you know. So I think that's difficult for men.
I don't think you'd think of going to Women's Aid if you looked at their websites, because their website actually says domestic violence is a gendered issue.
Yeah.
So, and I think, you know, when there are websites, I think Refuge is one of them that provides help for men and women.
Mm-hmm.
Yet their website is pink.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So it puts men off straight away.
Of course it does, and it should. I mean, you know, people are really coming forward now, you know, about their gender and maybe their binary or non-binary. So a lot of these services aren't being reactive to anybody's sexuality, are they? You know, because, you know, not all women like pink. And I think the whole way that they portray themselves, that it needs to be non-gendered, because you know, it's about men, and it's also about people who don't identify with the gender that they were born with, you know. So I just think that a lot of these support arenas, they need to have a look at, how they're presenting themselves, because like you say, if you were a man looking for help, you'd be confused as to where you can get that help.
Yeah.
And I think the work that you've done in telling your story is absolutely valuable, because I know that I've worked with men who have told their story about sexual violence, and that has helped men to come forward and tell their story. And I know that Survivors UK, which was based in Manchester, is specifically for men who have been involved in sexual violence, and they've done a lot of work in, you know, telling the story of people. And I think by doing that and being open and, you know, saying, I'm not going to be anonymous, I'm going to tell my story, it takes a lot of courage, but it also provides other men with, you know, an example of how you managed it, what helped you to get through. So I think sharing that story is absolutely an amazing thing to do.
Thanks. To be honest, I just think that to get over it, you have to own it.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And yes, this happened to me. Just to accept it. Yes, this happened to me, and it ain't going to happen again. And just own it. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that
Mm-hmm.
stands in the way of recovery. I think
Yeah, I think
people
you're right.
don't want to accept they've
And
been
I think
abused.
the first thing that men need to do is to be able to understand that it isn't about their masculinity. It's about control, and it's that other person. Yes, it can be physical violence, but I think that coercion is probably really dangerous, because it starts off as a drip, drip, drip effect. And to start with, you probably don't see that you're in it. And I don't know if you've been watching Casualty recently, but there's a story on there about a male nurse who is the victim of female perpetrated domestic violence. And it's very interesting to watch it, because as a person watching it, first of all, you kind of thought it's her who's the victim, and you made that completely erroneous kind of decision. But then it became absolutely obvious that it was actually the male. And even a friend of his initially thought it was him who was the perpetrator, but then realised it wasn't. And I think the way that story is being handled is actually, a positive, because it makes people realise it isn't just a gender-based thing, you know. And I know that a lot of these programs do ask for advice from survivors when they write these stories. Probably about 10 years ago on Hollyoaks, there was a male rape story. And I know they worked really closely with Survivors UK to make sure that that story was legitimate and reflected the feelings of the man involved. And I felt when I watched it, it was very much, it was handled in a very responsible way. So I think the media have got a place to play in this, and it is about trying to get us to think outside the box and to recognise that it's not a female problem. It can happen to anybody in a relationship. And as I said to you, I think that coercive control starts off very gradually, and before you know where you are, you're into it so deep that you then can't find a way out. And that's where professionals should come in to help support you and help you to see what's happening and to offer ways out. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that when you're in a situation of domestic violence, the time that you leave is probably the time when you're most at risk. And this is where, the deaths from domestic violence tend to happen, is when that partner leaves. And then obviously that creates.
And I also.
Go on.
Yeah, and when I talk to the police, the police denial of what I was going through, that did send me further over the edge, and that was after she left.
Yeah.
So you are very, very vulnerable at that time, yeah.
And I was really disappointed to hear that, because I know that when the police have training about sexual violence and domestic violence, it isn't gender-based. They're told that it can happen to anybody. And I think for men, there's always that worry that the woman is going to turn around and say, well, he did this to me, and that they're going to be believed. And I would say to anybody who's involved in any kind of, domestic violence situation, it's about trying to keep a record of what's happened to you, but to do that in a safe way where it can't be found, because that is key, isn't it, to having a kind of chronology of what's happened. Even if you're confiding in a friend, for example, who you implicitly trust. But I think the police handling of that, was absolutely inappropriate. And it just makes me very sad. And it's going to make men less likely to come forward if that's the response that they get. And women should be prosecuted for this, because it's a criminal offence.
I presented all my evidence to the police. I gave them a chronology,
Mhm.
like you said, of
Mhm.
everything that had happened. And the police dismissed most of it and said, we can only go on the latest event.
Oh.
That's the only thing I concentrated on. And I gave them photographs of my
Mhm.
flat smashed up, and
Mhm.
they said, "Oh, all we see is things knocked over," and there was
Mm.
things smashed all over the floor.
And yet, if that had been a woman, that response would probably have been very different.
Yeah,
They'd been putting safeguarding in place, they'd have been speaking to refuge. Um, so I think that response is totally discriminatory, and it saddens me because, as I say, the only way that we can improve things is if men feel that they can come forward. And I suspect that agencies that do support men see much more what the scale of the problem
yeah,
is, because those men probably wouldn't want to go to the police. So I think, it's the tip of the iceberg, isn't it, in terms of, what we know about male domestic violence and female perpetrators. I think it's much more widespread than we think. And I think, as women, we're told, this is what a coercive relationship looks like. But it almost needs to start in school, with young boys, so that they can
yeah,
see what a coercive relationship might look like, and that they're told that, violence by your partner, irrespective of their their gender, is unacceptable. I think it takes that. We need to almost go back to basics in terms of what we teach children about relationships.
definitely, yeah, definitely, definitely. I think you're right there, and I think it should start at
Hmm.
the in the schools,
Yeah.
and people should be instead of I mean, for instance, when I went to university, um, there was a friend of mine who applied to um, join the class women's studies,
Hmm.
and he was told no. There was they were up in arms about it. Everybody in the class was up in arms about it because they didn't want a male in women's studies. Why there was a women's studies group, I don't know, but
and yet
and this is
and
when it
yeah,
needs
and yet having a male involved in it probably
spinning.
would
So
have brought
university,
a different
then they're
perspective.
already educated. Yeah,
Having a mixed group in with something like that would have brought a different perspective to it, and would probably have made it richer in terms of experience. So I think, and I, I just wonder where we're going, because we're still very gender orientated, aren't we? In
yeah,
terms of what we think and what we feel, and yet there are people there who don't identify with a gender. So where are they going to fit in this grand scheme of things, and how do they feel about it? Um, so I kind of feel worried about the future, really, unless there's a big sea change in the way that we view violence in the home. Um, but I think all we can do is to keep banging the drum. And I think having this podcast, having you tell your story, and other survivors, that's a way of getting out there. But I suspect the people that need to listen to it aren't listening to it. You know. Um, but yes, it is. It's all very worrying, John.
and I mean, you mentioned sexual violence earlier on, and I mean, I went through sexual violence when I was with my ex-partner,
Hmm.
and I would say I was raped.
Hmm.
However, if you look at the definition of rape,
Yeah,
that itself is gendered.
it is, because it involves penetration with a penis.
Yeah,
So penetration with an object is not rape, it's sexual assault.
yeah,
So, I think that distinction is difficult. And I know the Sexual Offences Act was, has been changed and updated to reflect trafficking, and all those kind of offences. But it hasn't been updated to reflect that violence against men. And of course, rape carries a different potential sentence than sexual assault does. If you say sexual assault, that can range from pinching somebody's bottom to penetrating them with an object. So that's a huge, massive, difference in what sexual assault means. Whereas if you say the word rape, you know what that is.
That's a very powerful word, isn't it? It's a lot more powerful than sexual assault.
Yeah. And of course there's the issues about how that then makes that individual feel, because it kind of lessens it almost in a criminal sense, to say, well, it's sexual assault, it's not rape. And I think, I think that's probably something that needs to be looked at, because it needs to reflect the seriousness of the actual crime and what that sentence might attract. And I know for men who have been raped by another man, if they're heterosexual, they worry that that is saying that they're homosexual. Whereas, as I keep saying, sexual violence isn't about sexuality, it's about control. It's about controlling that other individual and demeaning them. So there's a lot of kind of bad press around, sexual violence against men, because men don't want to come forwards, because of the way it makes them feel. And I think that plays into the reporting of it. That we know that most rapes against women aren't reported, but I think it's something like 4% of rapes against men are reported, which is minute. And certainly over the time that I worked as a sexual offence examiner, I have examined male victims of rape, but they are in the minority. And the kind of support those men needed was different to what women needed. Because they were then questioning their sexuality, their masculinity. And I think that is different. There are lots of parallels, but there are also things that we need to take into account about how men are supported. And I think the support out there for men needs to be better publicised as well. So they know exactly where they can go for help, where they'll be believed, where they'll be supported. And it isn't about a conviction necessarily, because going to court is a difficult process. The outcome isn't always going to be what that victim thinks it's going to be. And most victims will say it's not about the court, it's about being believed. And being believed is the most important factor in being able to move forward and become a survivor.
100%. 100%. I think, like I said earlier, that the police not believing me sent me on a spiral downwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine.
And I did. I needed to be heard, but
yeah. And even if they'd said, yeah, we believe you and we're going to offer you support, but we don't feel we've got enough evidence to move this forward as a conviction, then that would at least have made you think, they believe me. And also, I mean, if you're a woman and you're in a new relationship, you can actually go to the police and find out if that individual has been involved in domestic violence in the past. But I don't know whether the same could be said for men. And if your perpetrator is in another relationship, how is that man going to know that he's at risk? Whereas male perpetrators are on the police radar. So female perpetrators almost got a free pass.
Yeah.
And it's not right, and it makes me really sad because, like I say, it isn't gender based. It's about that individual that perpetrates those crimes, and that it's not about gender.
Yeah, I mean, because my abuser drove me crazy so much that and I talk about this in the book, that I cut myself, and she called the police because I'd cut myself, and the police turned up and took her outside and took me to one side and asked me what was going on, and I said she'd kicked me, bit me, spat at me, she threatened to stab me in the eye, and they let her go and said to me, "Well, as long as you're all right now, mate." That was it. Now, flip that, and she'd said that about me, I would have been arrested.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they would have been pushing for a conviction as well, John. I mean, it's difficult when a crime's reported because the police have to go to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, and they have to present their evidence. And then the CPS lawyer will say, yeah, you've got enough evidence, charge them, or no, you haven't. So that strength of evidence is important. But I would have said that, if they've come to your home and you've told them that, why did they not then get you examined and photographed? Because that's what they would have done to a woman.
Yeah.
I mean, there is
Yeah.
a program out there called VEV, Visual Evidence for Victims, and it's actually supported by Victim Support. So essentially, if you're a victim of domestic violence and you've got injuries but you don't want to go to the police, you can go to a VEV centre and a crisis worker will photograph your injuries in a forensically evidentially sound way. They will take a statement off you, and then they will keep that. And if you later come back or you later decide to go to the police, that evidence is then admissible. But that is something that isn't widely publicised. And I know the Glade at Worcester, which is Sexual Assault Referral Centre, is a VEV centre. And I also know that West Mercia Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Centre is a VEV centre. But that should be plastered all over the place so that victims know that they've got an option where they can collect that evidence in a forensically secure way. And then later, if they need to go back and rely on that, they've got it. So there's a lot of things out there that people aren't aware of.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, and that's very, very important to know.
Absolutely. And I mean, when I did the VEV course, and you're trained by a police forensic investigator, they show you how to take the photos, how to measure. You're given a camera specifically for it and a printer, and that the only thing that you use that camera and printer for is to take those evidential photos. And then we were trained to take a statement off the individual that would stand up in court. And I think having something like that is absolutely integral, because it means then that you can go to that place, that you're not judged, that you're believed. They take your evidence, they store it securely in a safe, and then 6 months down the line, if you need that evidence, then that is something that would stand up in court. So I think it's really bad that all this support that is out there isn't kind of in the public domain.
Yeah.
If you're a woman and you've been a victim of domestic violence, you can Google it and it'll take you straight to Women's Aid. If you're a man, it's not quite straightforward, because you think, well, where can I go? What are my options? Where can I go that I will be listened to? And I remember going to a talk at the University of Worcester a while ago, and it was presented by a man who worked for Women's Aid. not locally, but somewhere else in the country. And he'd set up a special kind of group for men. And he was talking about his experience, and how he supported men and the differences and why men find it difficult to report. But again, that was something that was available via Women's Aid. So, I think maybe, a lot of these groups need to be rebranded so it's not gender specific.
Yeah. But there's a narrative that needs to be adhered to, isn't there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know that they do amazing work. I'm not by any means sort of denigrating what they do. And the IDVAs, the Independent Domestic Violence Advisor support that they give is absolutely amazing. But that support should be available to any gender of person who needs it. And it shouldn't just be about women. And, going back to that government document, Violence Against Women and Girls, it ran into hundreds of pages. And, I thought, well, what about men? What about boys? We talk about child sexual abuse, and child sexual abuse is not gender based. It's accepted that child sexual abuse happens to boys and girls. So the fact that they called it Violence Against Women and Girls kind of made me think, well, what about boys, What about young boys? And, in that document, there was stuff about education, and about how professionals respond. And I just thought you completely missed the point here, to even have a government publication called Violence Against Women and Girls completely skews that view that violence, whether domestic or sexual, is not gender based. But the government couldn't get it right. So,
Emma, is there any light out there? Is there any positivity at all?
I don't know, John. I mean, I just hope that over time and via the media telling male stories, that I hope that it will drip, drip, drip into the public kind of psyche, if you like, and that people generally in society will understand that it isn't gender based. So I guess on one hand, I have to try and remain hopeful. But on the other hand, it's White Ribbon Month in November, isn't it? Where we do domestic, the 10 days of action for domestic violence. And I think that's something that needs to maybe reflect the issues about male domestic violence. I have got a contact for you who is absolutely passionate about domestic violence, so I'll ping that across to you. And he may be somebody that you could work with, because I think he would totally welcome that, and he's very much of the view that it isn't gender based. So I will send you his details, and maybe get in touch with him before White Ribbon, and just see if there's something that you can do together.
Awesome, thanks. I know that next month, with it being Domestic Violence Awareness Month,
in
October, the local coffee shop here in Malvern, Abbey Road Coffee, they've said that they'll hold a book signing for me to bring more awareness to male victims of domestic violence.
Brilliant.
So that's awesome, and that's what we need. We need people who are supportive.
It is, absolutely. Even if one person reads that book and takes away that message, it's making a difference. And I think that is absolutely imperative, that happens. And I think the only way that we can change it is to just be there and be persistent, and not be ignored. And you know, as far as I'm concerned, the colleagues that I work with know very much how I feel passionately about, you know, domestic and sexual violence. And, you know, I would wish to support anybody that's going through that. But I think the other thing that we tend to forget is the long-term sequelae of this on that individual, you know, so that we know that people who've experienced sexual and domestic violence have a, you know, over a 50% chance of serious mental health problems in the future. And I think that that has got a lot to do with the way that that initial disclosure is dealt with. So people who feel they've been believed and are supportive are less likely to have mental health problems than people that haven't been able to disclose and have kept it to themselves. And, you know, they're very much at risk of mental health problems. And I often say to patients of mine who have mental health problems, I always ask them, I say to them, I'm going to ask you something now, and I just want you to tell me honestly, have you got a history of domestic or sexual violence in your past? And sometimes they go no and sound shocked, and sometimes they'll say, well, actually, yes, I have. And I'll say, well, do you want to talk to me about it? Do you think this is something that we maybe need to try and find a way to deal with, so that it gives you some form of closure and that you can manage the effect of that on you? So I would say to professionals, never be afraid to ask. If you know, ask the question, because I know that there's good evidence that a lot of people who have been victims want to be asked. They're waiting for a professional to say to them, has this happened to you? Because that then gives them the opening to say it has. So I would say to any professional, you know, if you've presented with somebody who is suffering with anxiety or depression or stress or whatever, I ask them, because, you know, the worst that can happen is they say no. The best that can happen is they say, yes, I have, and that you then can say, right, okay, what can we do to help? How can we support you with this? How can we help you to process what's happened to you in a healthy way? And often when people come back to you when you've organised that support, that can be quite a pivotal moment in their recovery, because they've had that opportunity to talk about that and process it and move forwards.
Well, thanks, Emma, for the discussion today. It's like, as with all the discussions I've been having lately, absolutely riveting. Especially, can you tell me what that VIV is again, please?
VEV, visual evidence for victims.
Awesome. I think everybody should
Yeah.
know that and understand that and know where they can go for that.
I'll send you some links to it, and I'll see if I can find out who's running it now. I know the lady that used to run it. I'll try and find out who's running the project at the moment, and I'll let you know their details. And I'll also put you in touch with that chap that I was telling you about, because I think he'd be really open to doing some work with you.
Awesome.
And he does a lot of training for clinical commissioning groups around domestic violence. So that might be, you know, partnership that you could explore.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks very much for that.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I think my takeaway message is to anybody who is going through this at the moment, you know, try and talk to a professional. And to the professionals out there, keep an open mind and ask the question, because it might make a massive difference to that one person.
Emma, thanks very much for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome, John. You look after yourself, and let me know if there's anything else I can do to support you.
Thanks very much indeed. You take care now.
And you, love. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.